What we typically do, guys, when we talk about Critical Role is we do a brief recap. Typically, these are 4-hour episodes, and so our recap's about 15 to 20 minutes. We talk about, hey, this is what happened. These were the big points that happened. And then in about 15 minutes from now, we do a full breakdown reaction. So if you're checking out just the YouTube video, that's only the replay discussion or the summary of what happened. In the link below, there's a link to the entire video, and you can check that out as well. But Will, why don't you kick us off on what happened in episode 21 of Campaign 3 of Critical Role?
Absolutely. So we pick up with the party basically launching into this encounter with these clay golems that sprang up around the earring, potentially this final line of defense. However, one thing of note is that Ashley Johnson is absent this week. We are told that she has asymptomatic COVID. So Laura actually will be playing Fern. So everyone rolls initiative and basically combat begins. But first things first, Orem is still like trying to get this earring. So he focuses on attacking the case, which they had started to do in the previous episode. Excuse me. But he's still not making very much progress at all. So Laudna takes the rock chisel out of her hair and runs up and plants it into like this small crack that has formed in the case. And basically it's like, Ashton, like hit my chisel to kind of hopefully split this thing wide open. So Ashton runs up, smacks it twice. And it basically does like slam the rock chisel in and kind of break open the case a bit. Like it finally kind of shows some damage. And they're like, okay, we're finally getting somewhere. And Laudna actually had to hold that in place while Ashton did that. So once that was finished, she kind of tries to scurry away. And these golems now take their reactions to have opportunity attacks on her. And they just pummel her.
Obliterate her.
Yeah, Matt describes it as like her getting like flung across the room, like skidding across the floor. And she actually falls unconscious. So these things definitely are, no walk in the park.
It was like 40 or 50 or more points. I think they each hit for like 20 points of damage.
Yeah.
Each. They both got double swings. So it was pretty insane.
It was brutal. So Fern, again, played by Laura this session, cures wounds on Laudna to get her back up. And she summons Mister and kind of is positioning him in different parts of the room. Chetney, however, uses his attacks to finish smashing the case, and he grabs the earring and the rock chisel and is like, let's get the hell out of here. So Imogen uses command and tells the golems to grovel, and both actually fail their saves, which they have advantage. So this was pretty crazy. And they both basically bow before her, causing them to be like functionally prone for the next round. So because of that, Ashton unleashes on one, and he like causes a crater to form in its skin, but he notices that it like basically starts to reform. So they like have some sort of healing mechanic, at least to my understanding. So they're like, yeah, this is pretty dangerous. So they're all like, let's probably get out of here. So they're all trying to flee back into the previous room where there was the lion statue and the tiles on the ground that will trigger some sort of trap that they had, thus far avoided. So they're trying to get in the room, but basically FCG and Fern are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place and unable to get to safety. So FCG tries to grappling hook basically over the golems to make it to safety, but he fails, and his grappling hook basically just lands in the other room. So Chetney grabs his grappling hook and basically like fireman like tugs him to like fling FCG and like catches him on his back basically, and then like leaps himself into the other room and like lands on top of the lion statue. And I think he rolled, I don't know if it was like a natural 20, but
it was up there for sure.
Yeah, it was like an insane acrobatics. And I think Matt was like, okay, so you're on a lion, on a werewolf. And it was funny. So then Fern is, I think she actually does roll a natural 20 to just barely avoid like getting grabbed by the golems, as she does make her way to the rest of the party as well. So then they're like, okay, let's peace on out of here. So they go for the door and it won't budge. And come to find out, the verdict, the other group, has used Bell's Hell's immovable rod against them and has essentially locked them in this room. So now the party's freaking out because they did not expect this. They've got the golems here. They're in the trapped room, and they're basically just locked in here.
This was like the best moment of the episode where they were like, "Let's get out, let's get out, let's get out," and then they realized they couldn't, and Matt just smiled, and Travis was like, "Wow!" It was so good.
It really was amazing. And so they're freaking out, and Imogen basically makes the first move, and she misty steps back across the room past the golems to the other side of the earring chamber where there's more rooms that they haven't checked out. So she goes back there, opens the door, and in this room there is another lion statue, so presumably more trapped tiles. And so she's like, okay, I'm going to use my action to look for the trapped tiles in this room, but she rolls poorly and basically doesn't see anything. So while this is happening, the rest of the party is like, I guess we have to deal with these golems. And so they start attacking the golems. But while this is happening, Laudna gets out the magnets that they purchased and gives some to FCG. And he fashions, or not really fashions, he just uses the magnets to get the earring and then like magnetizes that to the roof of his mouth, kind of like to hide it from the verdict and make sure that they can get it out of here safely, hopefully. So he does that. They keep working on the golems. They eventually are able to take both of them out. It is a rough fight, though. Nothing too crazy mechanically, or anybody didn't pull any insano moves or anything. Just typical attacks, and eventually get them down. So then they're pretty worn out at this point, and the verdict is, breathing down their necks. They clearly have locked them in that other room, so they're close. So they're like, what do we do? So they decide to go in one of these adjacent rooms from the earring chamber and basically close the door behind them and just kind of regroup, take a rest, and try to figure out their next move. And Imogen basically comes to the realization that, hey, I can activate those trapped tiles from in here using my telekinesis. So how about we just chill in this room, like effectively try to take a short rest. And if I hear them come into that room, I'll trigger the trap. And they're like, okay, I mean, that works for us. And so they start their short rest. And about 10 minutes in, they hear the verdict enter the adjacent room. So Imogen activates the trap, and all they can hear is like the stone on stone of that statue moving, and then like the blaze of fire, and they can hear screams and basically heat emanating from the door.
Oh my gosh.
Then the screams go silent, and excuse me. So while that's happening, Chetney and Orem like brace the door because the verdict are trying to get through to get out of this trap, but they successfully hold the door shut so that they're stuck in there. So the screams go silent, and then Imogen triggers the trap again. And so now there's more screaming, and the door is actually beginning to catch fire. The screaming stops again, and they hear Severos is down, called out from the other side. So then they wait a bit, and they kind of hear from the other room what seems to be them dragging or tossing the unconscious person out of the room. And once that happens, Imogen triggers the trap a third time, and it's just, more hellfire again, and then there's silence. So they wait a tick, and then Orem opens the door, and it just falls off its hinges. And inside, there's no bodies, and the entire room is just like scorched earth. This is clearly the first time these traps have ever been sprung, because you can see the char everywhere. And there is the table's on fire in the room, and there's like this streak of like soot that has been dragged across the floor, and clearly it's been the verdict dragging like an additional body out of this room. So the party basically kind of investigates further, and they come to find in the next room Hutchin, the Dragonborn, and the Goblin of the verdict are both unconscious, with the Furbolg, I think, kind of looking over them. And two other members of the verdict are hiding in this room, yet to be revealed. But FCG comes in and is like, hey, I'm here to help. Cast Spare the Dying on both of the unconscious people. And they're basically like, let's kind of have a peace treaty right now. Let's have a truce. This place is messed up. I think all of us got more than we bargained for. And like let's just, peace treaty. And since FCG is actually, spare the dying, and I think Fern actually cure wounds on Hutchin, the verdict seemed to, believe them. And so there is a bit of peace. And the verdict asks if the Bell's Hells were successful, and Laudna lies and rolls a deception check and says that they're not yet. And so they're like, well, then why are you leaving? And they say, we still have stuff to do. So it's not entirely sure. It's not entirely clear, rather, if the verdict believed them. But again, there is this truce happening. And so they're like, okay, we still have we're going to take a moment to collect ourselves, but, y'all go ahead. So the Bell's Hells exit, and now they're in the journal room, and they're kind of looking at it to see how it's trapped. And they do seem to find that there is some trap mechanic on it, but Chetney is able to swipe it with a very deft sleight of hand. I think he rolls a 25, which Matt says was the exact DC. Right. So he snags the journal, and then they keep backtracking, and he looked for his ever smoking bottle that he threw, but that is gone. And they're back in the Hishari cult room, and Ashton actually takes one of the helmets of the sets of armor, and Ora makes a history check and basically is, oh yeah, you're familiar with the Hishari. They were this commune around this cult leader. He's very charismatic, but the town was decimated.
And they dated it like a few decades earlier too, which was interesting.
Yeah. And he's basically like, it was just a cautionary tale. And then as they're making their way out, they're basically reminded of the extra bounty from Hexam that was like, if we sufficiently embarrass him, we can make even more money. And on this note, Ashton is pissed. Ashton's like, this is more than we bargained for. This is more than we were told. Like, I want to embarrass this guy. Like, let's fuck him up. Let's steal some shit of his shit. Like, he's just mad and wants to do something. So they ultimately decide to go back up to the living quarters and see what they can find up there. So they make their way to Hydroga's office, and there is a locked drawer that the verdict had tried to get into but couldn't. Like, this is a very sophisticated lock, and they weren't able to pick it. So Ashton tries, and he is able to get it. I don't know if it was a natural 20 or just
it was a crazy high roll.
Yeah, I remember that. It was crazy high, and it was like, yeah, you spite lockpick this. And
right.
So he gets in there and basically takes everything inside, which was a stack of papers and these glasses. So after they've stolen all of that, they make their way back out of the manor, and I think they exit through that kitchen door toward the back, and then they're like, okay, let's head toward the front and put an end to this thing. And that's basically where it goes to break. If you want to take it from there.
So after break, Hydroga's there waiting for them and is a bit suspicious and they're pretty much like, hey, we have the earring, we did it. And he's like, really? Like, kind of thrown and surprised that this group was successful. Sure enough, FCG, who's been talking with like a lisp this whole time because of the earring in his mouth, kind of overly exaggeratively describes going, pulling it out and giving it to Hydroga. And then they have basically just a conversation of this funny back and forth where Hydroga actually says, like, I didn't expect you to be successful. Guards, kill them. And everyone's like, ah! And he's like, I'm just kidding. And he's like, even though I'm disappointed, you guys were successful. Congratulations. Actually, in kind of like if you ever been to like Disney World where you go on a ride and they snap your picture, it was kind of like that kind of moment where he takes them into the foyer with the two statues with the rugs on it. And Hydroga's kind of like, oh man, I have a lot of cleanup to do. And basically there's a painting that he points them to that effectively has snapped the party's goofy expressions as like the winning party. And it's almost sort of like implied like this first annual heist has, here's the winning group. But Hydroga clearly plans to use it for like museum marketing, so to speak. And then the party asks, like, what's going to happen to the verdict? And he's like, they will be dealt with. And everyone's kind of quiet. And he's like, I'm just joking. We're a museum. It's fine. All that to say, the party decides, we were successful. We got it. Let's get on out of here. So the party leaves, and as they've left, I don't know if you mentioned this, but they had stolen the book from the mage's name.
Yeah, Vespin.
Vespin Chloris, and they had stolen the helmet, the stack of papers, and they start talking. They're like, should we really go back to our tavern, like our inn? Because we don't really want Hydroga to know where we are. And then also we know the Verdict was staying there as well. We don't really want them to know where we are.
Right.
So the party decides, you know what, let's go get our horses at like 3 a.m. Let's just go camp outside of town. And they do that with pretty relative ease. It's really no big deal. They go out, they camp. In the morning, Imogen does prestidigitation on everyone because everyone just looks wrecked. FCG is like, hey, Imogen, do you want me to cure your blueness? And she's like, yeah, sure. So he cures it. And then he doubles that with, I'm just going to make sure it worked. And he does detect thoughts. And he says, I want to go as deep as I can. Now, if you remember from previous episodes, they've had sort of like this back and forth, this mind meld. But Imogen resists it, casts a 19, beats him out, and basically says, like, what you doing there, FCG? And even then adds on to that, like, don't do that ever again. Have a smiley day. And FCG's like, that's my line. And then this is probably a little bit out of order, but he does identify the goggles at some point. And they are goggles. I can't remember what he called them, but basically they allow you to cast Charm Person on the person you're looking at through the goggles.
Yeah.
He also, at a later day, because the party's eventually going to head back to Dressar, he's going to cast Identify on the stack of papers and realize basically that these papers, which, by the way, are invisible, you can't see any print on the text is invisible. And Ashton even has this cool moment where he tries to rip it and it doesn't tear, and they realize it's enchanted. So that's why FCG identifies it. And they realize that it's only susceptible to cold to see the text. But we'll come back to that in a second. Everyone else is kind of looking at the trinkets they've picked up. Chetney is looking at the journal of Vespin Chloris and kind of like eagerly reading it. Laud is kind of over his shoulder, like, what does it say?
Yeah.
And as they look more into it, it starts to get a bit, Matt calls it derivative. It's kind of like the writing, like the person kind of loses, it almost seems like the writer kind of lost interest as they were writing through. And then they start to notice something, the ... And it's in that moment that they're like, no. And they realize this is not the journal of Vespin Chloris. This is a fake that Hydroga presumably crafted himself, wrote himself, and the whole museum's basically a sham. Chetney's super disappointed. He throws the journal into a swamp, which Laudna retrieves for fun activities when they're bored.
Yeah, and he even does the rip test, and it does rip.
That's right.
So that's
and
like how they
rip.
know.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah. Otherwise, the party's like, hey, let's kind of finish things up. Let's go by see Astani. Let's go to the Toymaker Shop. And then let's skip town and get back to Dressar because our mission is done. And they even send a message back to Gianna Hexam saying, hey, we were successful. We did it. And she's like, great job. You did it. So Chetney and Orem decide to head to Not Forgotten, the Toymaker Shop. And because this is where the Toymaker previously, the old woman had mentioned a collaborator she had appeared named Ultgar, who Chetney knows of. And so he wants to follow up on that loose end. So they go in, they're kind of perusing the shop, and she's like this nice, sweet old lady. And then Chetney starts striking up a conversation. He's like, where are you from? And she's like, I'm from Uthadurn. And he's like, you ever get back there? And she's like, no, not really. And he's like, you ever met someone named Ultgar? And like the vibe totally changes. She's like, why do you ask? And Matt talks about how it's like this Wild West moment where like Chetney like reaches down for his chisel, and then Matt says that this woman Zadro, it reaches down for her chisel, and it's this very tense moment where she's like, are you friend or foe of Ultgar? And he's like, I'm not a friend of him at all. She's like, that's good. And they don't really gain any new information other than they both sort of simultaneously agree that Ultgar is a terrible person, and that's pretty much that. In fact, as Chetney's leaving, Orem's like, what the heck was that? What was that? Because it was like so awkwardly tense all of a sudden. And then Chetney basically is like, Ultgar is the worst. He's literally the worst. and talks about how he abandoned like the woodcrafting profession, and is basically a big trader for that. The party also decides to check on Astani, and so Astani's like kind of old man wandering, like eating bread, and there is this moment where Astani kind of oddly asks, like, "Oh, are you guys leaving?" Orem does an insight check and actually gets a whisper from Matt, something going on there that he picks up from Astani.
Yeah, well, I think it's because they weren't going to see him, and they were just leaving, and so Matt had Astani like be there and was like, "Come and talk to them."
Yeah. He was kind of awkwardly waiting on the path, so to speak. I guess. Yeah. So Astani actually offers, "Hey, I'll walk you out of town." Mm-hmm. That's kind of why they're walking together, and in sort of like this hushed, like keep this between us, basically talks about how if they're going to go check out the Omen archive, if they're going to go follow that path on what happened to the Loomis twins, you need to know that the Loomis twins had joined this. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It's like it's an organization that invests itself into researching and discovering like artifacts and sort of like old ancient history. And Astani describes it as it's really grown in recent years, and it's become something more than just like a hobbyist type function.
Yeah.
But basically implies that the reason that they were killed is likely because they had somehow like poked their nose where it didn't belong within this group. And basically says, hey, if you do head to EOS, look for Eben Kai, a professor at the seminary, and actually gives them a note that says this will vet you guys for her. The party then decides, okay, let's get out of town. Let's head on our way. And they travel pretty much without any issues. This is also when they get the identify on the goggles. It's when they do the identify on the papers to realize that the frost damage shows the font. So Lana does, frost damage on it, and they start going through the papers. And there's a few different things. One of them is a like purchase order for what seems to be some kind of object, and they realize it was the relic, one of the objects in the museum rooms.
Yeah.
Which is further evidence that this museum is actually a bunch of duplicates. It's a bunch of just fake things. So there's that. There's also like random notes where Hydroga's clearly been keeping tabs on Gianna Hexam, trying to figure out like what's she doing, what are her dealings. Mentions that there are these small boxes that she seems to be picking up on like about a 3-month cadence, but it's not clear what they are, but these are individual boxes. And Matt actually mentions that Ashton with the nobodies, whenever they broke in, would have remembered seeing this box before, getting blitzed in the back of the head. And then also there's this name that keeps popping up in the notes, and it's a very particular abbreviation, like a codified abbreviation, sp.y.sh-n. And basically, I think someone, maybe it was Orem, does like a history check and rolls extremely high. And the SP, like the start of it, he basically says, like, this to be likely, I think he said spiraling shin.
Yeah.
He said he didn't know the middle initials. And then I don't remember what the last one was either. I don't know if you remember.
I took it to mean the entirety of it was spiraling shin.
Okay. Yeah. And I think he even said it was like almost like a signature, like a notable, like you would have seen this to know it meant that. Other than that, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that happened. They do have a discussion as they're getting back to town. They're pretty impressed that the horses are alive. They're like, man, yeah, well, should we? I think someone even jokes like, should we kill it anyway? And it's around this time that FCG kind of retorts back like, well, it doesn't really matter. They don't have souls. And there's like this very mini discussion or debate on, do the horses have souls? Like, are they, anyway, it's just a funny conversation, I guess. The party does level up to level 6. And what else am I missing?
I think that was pretty much it.
Yeah, so the party levels up to 6. They do their HP rolls. And that is what happened on episode 21 of Campaign 3 of Critical Role.
Pop, pop.